Hello, welcome to part two of our president lecture. Today we're going to focus on all of the powers the president has and how they are used. Let's get started. All right, first and foremost, let's talk about the legislative powers. These are the powers the president has that involve making of laws. So the legislative branch makes the laws. Here's the president's role in making those laws. First and foremost, we have approve or veto legislation. So he signs it into law or he vetoes it. Now, he's got a couple of options, which we've talked about when we talked about the bill making process, but he can veto it or he can do the pocket veto if Congress is not in session. The one thing that the president doesn't have is called a line item veto. Certain state governors, many state governors, have this option to just go through and be like, oh, don't like this part of this bill, and they can just veto that part, and then they can leave everything else. The president cannot do that. It is, you sign it all, or you veto it all, which is a little different than at the state level. So sometimes you will hear about a line item veto. There are times that people talk about wanting the president to have a line item veto, and it'd take an amendment to get that to happen. He can propose legislation. There are various ways that he can do this. The best example of this is the State of the Union address that is the president must give. It's constitutionally required. He can either speak directly to Congress, as you know, they do now, or in the past presidents, Jefferson is kind of well known for this. He just wrote a letter and then someone read it on the floor of Congress to get this kind of lined up. But the State of the Union is a great place to do proposed legislation of what the president would like to see happen in the future, in the coming year. And then our last one is call a special session of Congress. This is a power in the Constitution for the president, but it won't ever really be used today in the 21st century because Congress meets year round. Back in the Founding Fathers time period and kind of what they felt that would be Congress's job, they would only come in for 4, maybe 5 months out of the year, and then the other months they're not there. They're back home doing their other job, and so national emergencies do happen. And so the Founding Fathers said we need to be able to call them back into session because sessions only start in January unless the president says otherwise. The next power is the executive power. This is the power to enforce laws. So this is the vested power of the president that's in the Constitution. They can appoint and then with Senate approval, or remove cabinet officials, under cabinet officials, ambassadors, the people that, there's about 4,000 jobs in the bureaucracy that he can appoint. He can remove them, meaning he can fire most of them without cause. For whatever reason, it doesn't have to be a legitimate cause on why he wants to remove the individual. The exception to this, there are certain commissioners and certain in independent regulatory commissions, which are IRCs. We will talk about them in the bureaucracy, but he cannot remove them without cause. And there's a couple of other spots like the FBI director, the CIA director, they have to have cause to remove them. Another executive power would be the executive order. The executive order is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but it's there. It's kind of an implied power, and it is the ability of the president to give a rule or an order. I don't like using order in the definition, but there it is, to the bureaucratic agencies on how to implement a law passed by Congress. And then you have executive privilege. This is a situation in which the president needs kind of frank advice. And so because of that, his closest advisors oftentimes are granted executive privilege, meaning they do not have to respond to subpoenas. Many times when they do, when Congress does subpoena them or a court of law subpoenas them, they will go in and claim executive privilege, say, I'm not going to show up. Then it goes to courts, and the courts decide whether or not this person is going to be forced to testify and answer questions, either typically in Congress, but it could be a court of law too. Diplomatic powers of the president. So these are all dealing with how he interacts with foreign countries. First and foremost, he appoints diplomats. These are ambassadors to other countries. They are going to be promoting U.S. interest in that country. Depending on the country, you either want a career diplomat, someone who has had that experience before, is really valuable in those countries because they're strategic partners or, they're kind of adversaries of the United States. Others are more kind of, just, funsy kind of, hey, look, I'm like, the ambassador to Timbuktu or whatever. And they are not as needed or as kind of, I want to say this, as delicate of situations where, a seasoned hand is needed there. Following that is diplomatic recognition. This is just the president gets to recognize the existence of other countries. The great example is we, the United States, do not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. It's an agreement we have with China not to recognize their independent status. Granted, Taiwan does claim to be the independent, the democratic government of China. Following that is negotiate treaties. Once again, Senate has to approve these treaties, but it is, they are with other countries to, end a war or to transfer land. Sometimes it could be to prevent, the proliferation of nuclear arms and those sorts of things that could be done through treaties. And then you have executive agreements. Executive agreements aren't specifically mentioned in the Constitution either. So it's kind of an informal power, but they are definitely there. And this is when the president can enter into a treaty-like agreement with another country or other groups of countries, but it's only as good as long as both countries are agreeing to abide by it. Once, like in the the United States, we get a new president minimum of every 4 years, maximum of every 8. So at the end of that president's term, the next president doesn't have to abide by an executive agreement. Great examples of these are the climate accord, the Paris Climate Accord, and the Iran nuclear agreement. From there, we have military powers. Military powers, he's commander-in-chief. He's the top civilian leader of the military. The founding fathers were very insistent that the top leadership of the military would be civilians and not actual military. Typically, they do have other civilian leadership has previous military history. It's also why one of the reasons that the informal qualifications would be military experience. He also is going to command the military, meaning he's going to direct their actions. Like if in a war, he oftentimes will be the one who has to give the order to, bomb some country or do a seizing of a ship or, whatever it might be. It's got to come from the president because he is the commander in chief. Also, a military power here is the commission of all officers. So anyone who gets commissioned as an officer, it's done by the president. He approves all of those. And then he also has to appoint the civilian leadership. And the civilian leadership would be Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of the Air Force, and the Secretary of the Army. If you watch many TV shows like NCIS, you oftentimes hear them referred to as SecNav. That's the Secretary of the Navy. That's their shorthand. But they are individuals who are civilians that are at the top of that branch of the military. Now moving on to, let's discuss the war powers. So the Constitution, and we've touched on this in class, but the Constitution says congressional powers is to declare war, and then they also, of course, control the purse strings. That's a big one, but it also can backfire if they try to use that. The big thing here is that Congress gets to declare war and the president gets to command that war. So anytime we are actually threatened or threatened and or attacked, the president can act because he's commander in chief. So they didn't want all war-making powers in one branch, and this is how they split them up. The modern context for this is it's a little concerning, and the president seems to have a real big upper hand because the president is ultimately in control of our nuclear weapons, the nuclear football. Now there's a process to go through there. You gotta, there's a thing called the biscuit, and you gotta snap it, and you gotta give a code, and then someone else has got to give a code, and you gotta communicate. And there's certain code words that are all within this biscuit that the president, this little credit card thing that the president always has on him, or should. Bill Clinton apparently lost his for a short while. They have this way to ensure that the president is actually the one authorizing this nuclear, attack. But that's a different thing that the founders didn't think of, and that's a mighty powerful tool. Then we also have the Vietnam War situation, in which we were engaged in a years-long war, almost 2 decades war, and there was never an official declaration of war on that. I mean, Congress authorized money, but as we went along, we realized, we found out over time that money was not being used as it was supposed to. The Nixon was not using the money as given by the budget for those years. And then also he, kind of misled the American public about why we were in Vietnam. So in response to those things, Congress passed what's called the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And this was a way to kind of rein in the president's power for war making. So first off, president is supposed to notify Congress in advance, but if he can't do it in advance, then he needs to notify them in writing within 48 hours. Either one needs to be in writing. Now, many presidents very rarely notify Congress in advance. It's always typically within the 48 hours post, just because they do worry about leaks and, getting it on the news before it actually happens. And then, it kind of, the target they were aiming for is all of a sudden no longer there. He has a 60-day limit on operations to engage in the troops into some sort of combat without having much say from Congress. At the end of those 60 days, then he needs them to kind of give him some additional direction, either by declaring war, or giving them an additional 30 days, and then he can ask for an additional extension, or say possibly passing an authorized use of military force, an AUMF, which we've talked about before in class. Once that 60 days is up, if Congress does not give an extension of some sort, then he has 30 days, the president has 30 days to pull the troops out of that area. Congressional options, if the president does not kind of respond to that, first and foremost, it's going to be they can, not pay for the war. Like public relations, that's not a good option at all. So they can typically they're going to pay for it. They can demand removal. They can make a case to the American public why they need to pressure the president to bring the troops home, that it's senseless, and they can pull in our men and women are dying for no reason. We're not a justified cause. They can declare war, or they can do that extension. All right, judicial powers of the president, how he kind of has some say in the interpretation and the application of the laws. First and foremost, he appoints judges. This is probably I would probably say the most important long-term power of the president, because judges are there for life. Federal judges are there for life. So like tenure, like forever. So it could be decades that these judges are going to be there interpreting and continuing the influence of the president who put them onto the bench. It's the most lasting impact, as I just said. It does require Senate confirmation. It used to be allowed to have a filibuster. The nuclear option on Supreme Court judges was instituted on April 5th, 2017. I will say that the Democrats actually started the nuclear option. They're the ones who got rid of the filibuster option on appointments, for any appointment except Supreme Court judges. They did leave Supreme Court justices as filibustered ability abled, but then the Republicans went ahead and removed that option in April of 2017. He also gets the pardon power. This is forgiveness of a crime, essentially. There's a couple of options. He can do amnesty, which is forgiveness for the whole group. Probably the most famous in American history of amnesty is post-Vietnam, draft dodgers were given amnesty. Lincoln offered amnesty also to a lot of Confederate troops throughout the war, and deserters on the Union side. He gave them amnesty as well to come back and continue to fight. Another type of pardon is a reprieve, which means you get a cancellation or a postponement of your punishment, whatever that might be. He can give you a reprieve, which means that, he gets to completely cancel it out or cancel it out as long as you're on good behavior, or a timeout on it as long as you're on good behavior for so long, and then it would go away. The last type of pardon is a commutation, which is a release from prison early. So you're in prison, your term is 20 years, the president can give you a commutation. It's a communing of the sentence, and it's early. And so you basically it's on your record that you served your sentence, even though you may have served very little of it. The last kind of area of judicial power is implementation and enforcement of judicial decisions. As we'll talk about with the judiciary, when we get to the judiciary branch, they are not the pen, which is legislative, and they're not the sword, which is the enforcement, which is the executive. So they really, anytime they make decisions, they're going to have to rely on the other two branches. And so when it comes to that, the president has mighty power. So first off, he can just flat out refuse. What can the judicial branch do if the president refuses to follow their ruling? Now, I would hope the American public would, demand it, but we have seen throughout history that's not always the case. Andrew Jackson and the Cherokee Indians with, the Supreme Court saying you can't make them move, and he was like, watch me. Here you go, Georgia. I'll give you the military to help you make them move. And the other option here, if I can get it to come up on the screen, is what they refer to as foot dragging. The Supreme Court has said you must desegregate schools. And the president could be like, all right, we're going to set this timeline, and it's going to be like 5 years, or we're going to start it we're going to say, we're going to have this. You're going to drag your feet in trying to get it implemented or get it changed in the hopes that maybe you can get a different ruling, or you get enough laws passed that make that ruling no longer applicable, or you can get an amendment passed, and then it would definitely not apply either. Just a quick rundown of some other powers the president has that doesn't necessarily fit in some areas. A lot of these are going to be kind of informal powers a little bit. First and foremost, he's got the bully pulpit. He's an agenda setter. Whatever he talks about, then the media is going to focus on, the public's going to focus on. He can persuade with his bully pulpit. He can campaign. He can really try to influence people's opinions, because he has this big giant microphone, because he's the president, and whatever the president says gets covered by media sources. He is the party leader. So he, what he says goes for that party, regardless of how the party, maybe other people within the party feel about it. He's the party leader, and that really does influence the stance the party takes, the lineup. With President Trump, he was all about, in his campaigning in 2016, about build the wall, build the wall, build the wall. And that was not really kind of an issue within the Republican Party, but he made it one. And then you have signing statements. Oftentimes the president will, kind of see that public opinion or Congress has enough votes to override a veto, so he just chooses not to veto it, but he'll put a signing statement on how he hopes and how he plans to kind of implement this law as kind of a retort back to Congress of, hey, I don't like it. and this is how we're going to do it. And, you need to kind of accept it or pass a different law that maybe is a little more accepting to both of us. And finally, impoundments. Sometimes in the past, the presidents, Nixon was really kind of well known for this, would get the budget from from Congress. It'd be implemented, and there in the budget would specify how money was supposed to be being spent. Like it's supposed to, $2 trillion on, research and development for some Air Force plane. Okay. Nixon was famous for taking that money and not using it for what they said. So he can impound that money and just basically say it's not going to be used that way. Congress has responded by passing in 1974 the Impoundment Control Act, which basically says the president cannot impound money. It has to be spent the way that the budget specifies. Again, not a lot of punishment to kind of enforce that. There's not a lot of enforcement behind that, but it's there, and it would require the American public, if those issues ever come up, to kind of enforce that the president comply with the budget. All right, that is it for today. See you later.